Come to lesson 7 in the series of knowing God's will. And we are going to nail down the purpose for knowing God's will. Let me begin with several scriptures. Psalm 23 verse 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Again, Psalm 31 verse 3 says, for you are my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, you will lead me and guide me. And in 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16, all scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. So what can we conclude about knowing God's will? Is it for our benefit? Are we to know God's will to enjoy safety, blessing, honor? The purpose of knowing God's will is a life of righteousness that brings honor and glory to his name. Let me repeat that because I kind of stuttered. The purpose of knowing God's will is a life of righteousness that brings honor and glory to his name. God's will is for God, not us. We experience the byproducts of blessing and joy and peace. The platform for our obedience is not the byproducts, but the name of God and for righteousness itself. Let me say that again, and let me maybe substitute some words that make a little bit more sense. The motivation for our obedience is not to get something from God, but our lives would exalt the name of God and manifest his righteousness through us. Ask yourself this. If there were no tangible byproducts, health, joy, peace, prosperity, position, fame, power, if there were no byproducts in knowing and doing God's will, would you and I desire to know and do God's will? I'm reminded of a young man who deliberately and knowingly disobeyed God's will regarding purity. Do you know what God told this man? His will regarding personal purity was a sense of protection for this young man, but the purpose of God's will in this area was for God's name and righteousness. He told David that his deliberate and knowing disobedience resulted in an opportunity for others to blaspheme the name of God. The purpose of God's will is for God's name and righteousness. We simply enjoy the spillover. Now, we have covered several important issues in preparation for the nuts and bolts of knowing and doing God's will. The lessons to come will deal with the practicality of how to discover and to do God's will. Let's not become careless in that we abandon a previous lesson that truth comes from theology, and theology is the bedrock for a solid daily living experience. Theology reveals to us the mind and the heart of God. which will lead us to understanding what the will of God is, to glorify His name, to live righteously in a fallen, godless world. And as we do that, God blesses our motivation for doing this. And you and I will enjoy the spillover of our obedience and motivation. Next time we get together, we'll begin to talk about some of the nuts and bolts and the prerequisite. Next time we get together, the prerequisite for knowing God's will. There are certain things that must be met before we can know God's will and be motivated to do God's will. There are additional teaching resources available at this blog spot. I hope you will take advantage of them for encouragement and for growth and for challenge.